Mrs. Jenkins always looked so small when she stepped out of her car. It was a maroon station wagon, a relic from another era, and it practically swallowed her up. She waved goodbye to her mother, who was already halfway to the house, her purse swinging rhythmically at her side. The house was old, the kind that had been painted so many times that the wood looked like it was wearing layers of wrinkled skin. The shutters were a slightly different shade of brown than the siding, and the lawn was more weeds than grass. But the thing that always made the biggest impression on young Timmy was the porch swing. It was the same porch swing that his mother had sat on as a little girl, listening to her own grandmother's stories. It was still there, still squeaking gently, as if waiting for more tales to be shared. Timmy's mom walked up the crooked cobblestone path, her shoes clicking with purpose. She paused at the door to give Timmy one last look, a look that was a mix of love and regret. "You be good for Granny, okay?" she said, her voice barely carrying over the rustle of the leaves. Timmy nodded, trying to hide his apprehension. He knew that his great-grandmother was getting old, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But he also knew that she was his last living link to a past that was slowly slipping away. The door creaked open, and Granny's smile grew wider than the Cheshire Cat's. "Look what the cat dragged in," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with a mischief that Timmy had never seen before. She looked so much older than she had at Christmas, her skin paper-thin and her hair as white as freshly fallen snow. She stepped aside, revealing the dimly lit hallway behind her. It smelled faintly of mothballs and something else, something that Timmy couldn't quite put his finger on. The air was thick with the weight of the years, and it made him feel like he was walking into a museum rather than a home. The living room was a treasure trove of antiques. The sofa looked like it had been around since the dawn of time, its cushions flat and tired. There was a rocking chair in the corner that looked as if it might collapse under the weight of a strong sneeze. And the lamp on the end table had a shade that was so dusty it might have been a snow globe from a forgotten winter. Timmy's mom had told him that Granny didn't like to let go of things, that she had memories attached to every object in the house. As he looked around, he wondered what stories they held. Granny shuffled into the room, her slippers whispering across the worn-out carpet. She looked around, a hint of confusion in her eyes, as if she couldn't quite remember why she was there. Then she spotted Timmy and her face lit up again. "Oh, you're staying with me tonight," she exclaimed, as if it was the best news she'd heard in years. Timmy nodded, trying to match her enthusiasm. She handed him a glass of milk that had a slight film on the top and told him to make himself comfortable. The TV flickered in the corner, the sound of a black and white sitcom echoing through the room. Granny sat in her chair, her eyes glazed over as she watched the silent figures dance across the screen. Timmy sat on the couch, his heart racing. Every time he glanced at the clock on the mantel, the hands seemed to tick slower and slower. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The floorboards creaked, and he was sure he heard whispers just beyond the edge of his hearing. The shadows grew longer as the sun set, stretching like fingers across the room. Granny nodded off in her chair, her chin resting on her chest. Timmy tried to ignore the way her breath rattled in her throat, the way her eyes fluttered open and closed without focusing on anything. It was like watching a candle slowly burn out, and it made him feel cold all over. He pulled the blanket tighter around him, his eyes darting from the flickering TV to the stairs that led up to the darkness above. He heard a soft thump from upstairs, and his heart skipped a beat. Was it just the house settling, or was there something else? He tried to tell himself that there was nothing to be afraid of, that Granny had lived here alone for years without any trouble. But the way she'd looked at him earlier, the way she'd forgotten why he was there, made him feel like he'd been left with a stranger. A stranger who was slowly slipping away from him. Timmy took a deep breath and picked up the remote. He flipped through the channels, searching for the familiar blue splash of Nickelodeon, Channel 26. But the numbers on the screen just kept changing, landing on game shows, soap operas, and news reports that talked about things he didn't understand. No Drake and Josh, no SpongeBob, not even Full House that played late on Nick at Night. This added to Timmy's discomfort. He sighed and set the remote down, the TV static now the only company he had. He glanced at the clock again. It was only 7:30, and he had until morning when his mom would get him. On a whim, he turned to Cartoon Network, Channel 29. It was Adult Swim, the part of the night when the cartoons were for grown ups. The screen was a blur of bright colors and fast-moving images, and for a moment, Timmy felt a thrill of rebellion. He knew he wasn't supposed to watch this, but Granny was asleep. He settled in, ready to enjoy the illicit late-night cartoons. But the thrill quickly turned to horror as the episode of Family Guy began. The characters were doing something weird, and suddenly Peter started making fun of Jesus. Timmy's eyes went wide, and he held his breath, waiting for something to happen. Granny stirred in her chair, and the room grew colder. The laughter on the TV was suddenly too loud, too jarring. And then Granny's eyes snapped open, and she sat up with a start. "Turn that devil's show off," she shrieked, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. Timmy's hand shot to the remote, his heart hammering in his chest. He stared at her, his eyes wide with fear. Granny rarely got upset, but when she did, it was like someone had thrown a switch. She looked so different, so angry. Her eyes blazed, and her hand trembled as she pointed at the TV. "You don't watch that in my house." Timmy fumbled with the remote, his tiny hands slipping on the buttons. The TV switched off, plunging the room into darkness. He could hear Granny's heavy breathing, and for a moment, he was sure he heard something else, too. Something that didn't belong in this old house. Something that liked the devil's jokes. He swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. Was it just the TV show that upset her, or was there something more? What did she mean? The devil's show? Was Family Guy evil? "I'm sorry, Granny," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Granny's breathing slowed, and she leaned back in her chair. "It's okay, Timmy," she said, her voice softer now. "Just don't let it get to you." Timmy nodded, his heart still racing. He didn't dare look at the clock again. He didn't want to know how much longer he had to stay here. Remains palpable, and he's reluctant to check the time, not wanting to face the reality of his prolonged stay. Granny's eyes began to glaze over again, and she leaned back in her chair. "You know, Timmy," she began, her voice trailing off. "Your grandpa used to love watching cartoons with me. Before." She paused, her mind wandering. "Before he went away. Those were the good cartoons, not what they've got you watching nowadays. Full of nonsense." Her words were slurred, and she was clearly lost in a memory that Timmy didn't dare interrupt. Timmy looked around the room, the shadows dancing on the walls as the streetlight outside flickered through the lace curtains. He noticed a picture of his grandpa, a man he had never met, smiling down at him from the mantel. It was a stark contrast to the tension in the air. The TV was now a silent rectangle of black, the only sound the ticking of the clock and Granny's shallow breaths. He leaned back into the couch, his heart slowly returning to a normal rhythm. The cushions felt like they were swallowing him whole, and the room was so quiet he could almost hear the dust settling. As he stared at the ceiling, he heard another thump from upstairs. It was louder this time, more deliberate. His imagination started to run wild. Was it a ghost? Or maybe a burglar? Or maybe, it was just the house. Summoning all his courage, Timmy slid off the couch and tiptoed towards the stairs. Each step creaked, but he moved quickly, eager to prove to himself that there was nothing to be afraid of. He made it to the top and took a deep breath. The hallway was lined with doors, each one seemingly heavier than the last. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, echoing through the stillness of the house. Pushing open the door to the room at the end of the hall, Timmy stepped into a time capsule of his mother's childhood. The floor was covered with a threadbare carpet, and the walls were papered with a faded floral pattern. In the corner, a toy box lay open, spilling its contents onto the floor. His eyes widened at the sight of the treasures within. There were G.I. Joes with missing limbs, their plastic skin yellowed with age. Creepy Barbie dolls with matted hair and vacant stares. And an assortment of plastic army men, standing at attention, their weapons raised as if ready to fight off whatever had disturbed the peace of the night. The Ninja Turtles caught his eye. They were the old-school kind, with the bulging eyes and wide smiles of the 90s. They looked so different from the sleek, edgy figures he played with at home. He picked one up, turning it over in his hands. "This is probably the newest toy in this house," he murmured to himself, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. But even as he said it, the smile faded. The toys were cool, sure, but they were also a stark reminder of how long ago all this had been played with, how much time had passed since the house had been filled with the laughter of children. The Green Army men, however, held a special fascination for Timmy. He picked one up, examining it closely. It was a simple figure, but something about it spoke to him. He squinted at the bottom, where the words Louis Marx & Co. were etched into the plastic. He'd never heard of that toy company before. It was like holding a piece of history in his hand. Timmy looked at the floor, where the soldiers were scattered, frozen in the midst of a battle that had been forgotten for decades. The sight was almost hypnotic, and for a moment, he could see them come to life in his mind's eye, fighting bravely across the carpeted terrain. It reminded him of Call of Duty 3, the game he played at his dad's house. But these soldiers didn't need a controller to move, they were powered by imagination and the whispers of the past. Summary 1. Timmy finds comfort in the vintage Ninja Turtles toy, reflecting on the house's history and the passage of time. Upon closer inspection, the Green Army men fascinate him, with their mysterious origin from Louis Marx & Co. The toys bring a moment of tranquility as he imagines them in an epic battle, reminiscent of his favorite video game at his dad's house, bridging the gap between the past and present in his mind. He found himself lost in thought, staring at the plastic figures. The shadows grew darker, the air grew colder, but he didn't notice. His mind was racing with images of battles long ago, of the people who had played with these toys. Then he had a disturbing thought. What if soldiers that have died spirits were put into army men that kids played with? He quickly tried to bury that creepy thought. Shaking his head, Timmy turned his attention to the two sliding closet doors. They were made of mirrored glass, and the reflection of the moonlight cast eerie shapes on the floor. He approached them tentatively, feeling the coolness of the metal as he slid one open. The scent of old fabric and dust filled his nose, and he sneezed. Inside, the closet was packed with clothes from a different time. Dresses with puffy sleeves, suits with wide lapels, and shoes with pointy toes. There were records stacked up on the shelves, their covers faded and curled at the edges. He pulled out a few records, recognizing the names of the artists from stories his mom had told him. Elvis, Sinatra, even some classical composers. He placed them on the floor and started to look through them. The first few were music he didn't know, but then he saw it. A record titled Bedtime Stories for Little Ones. He picked it up, dusting it off with his shirt. Maybe it would help him sleep. He took it back to the living room and placed it on the dusty record player that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The needle dropped with a faint hiss, and the room was filled with the sweet sound of a woman's voice telling a story. The story was about a little boy who found a magic garden in his backyard. It was soothing, and Timmy felt his eyes growing heavy. But then he heard something else, something under the story. It was faint, but it was there. A sound like someone crying. But he didn't pay too much attention to it. Timmy started spinning the record back and forth like a DJ. He wondered what would happen if you spun the record back the other way at the normal speed it played to try to play it backwards. Curiosity piqued, he gently lifted the needle and placed it at the end of the record. The sound of the story played in reverse, the woman's voice now a series of gibberish, the music twisted into a cacophony that made his skin crawl. As the needle made its way to the center, the gibberish grew clearer, the sounds forming into words that made no sense. And then, as if the universe had aligned just to terrify him, he heard it. Clear as day, through the warped melody, Satan see thee. Timmy's heart stopped. His hands shook, and he could feel the blood drain from his face. He turned the record off and tried to forget it, but the sound of Satan see thee stayed in his head. He stared at the record, the words bedtime stories for little ones seeming to mock him now. He looked around the room, the shadows cast by the moonlight dancing around the furniture, making everything seem more menacing than before. The house felt alive with secrets, with whispers of the past that didn't belong to him. With trembling legs, Timmy approached Granny's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see the dim glow of a nightlight spilling into the hallway. The wood was dark and heavy, the kind that didn't give